order. So Jules, thank you so much for joining us. We got connected through a mutual friend, Tom Morgan, who I got to know quite well. Just set the frame for us a little bit. Who are you? What is your project? Just yeah, fill us in a little bit there.
Sure. So my name is Jules Evans. I'm an author, an academic, and a journalist as well. I have written 4 books. My first book was called Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations. That came out in 27 countries, was a Times Book of the Year. That was about the revival of ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism, how people are using it today. That came out 10 years ago. My second book looked at the history of ecstatic experiences, altered states of consciousness, how Western culture marginalized and pathologized these experiences for centuries, and the explosion of these experiences back into Western culture. In that book, really, I was saying we shouldn't be so afraid of these experiences. Often they're good for us. But I try to take a measured kind of approach and say they're not always good for us. They can lead to cultishness, delusion, superstition, these kinds of things. What happened since then is, of course, is Western culture's attitudes to ecstatic experiences have really shifted. I'm here in the UK at the moment. There's now, so many positive articles, documentaries, and so on, all about this retreat center, this experience, and so on. So in my last 2 projects, I've shifted to more of a focus on the risks of ecstatic experiences and how to handle some of the difficulties that arise. So my third book, which I co-edited with a psychiatrist called Tim Reed, was called Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergencies. Spiritual emergencies is a term for spiritual experiences which are messy and sometimes even kind of quasi-psychotic. And people have these kind of experiences sometimes through intense meditation or psychedelics or just spontaneously. And there's very little information out there. They will probably just be diagnosed with a kind of lifelong psychotic disorder. So in that book, we got 14 people to tell their stories of their spiritual emergencies, to describe them. They're quite beautiful in a way. They're often frightening, but there's, these are quite beautiful stories as well. And we asked them, what helped you? In these kinds of situations where there's very little medical understanding yet, it's good to ask people themselves, what did you find helpful in dealing with these? So that book came out in 2020, just at the start of the pandemic. And then in the last 2 years, I've been working on this Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project. Basically, the starting point for it was this feeling. I wrote an article in 2021 at the kind of high point of hype in this psychedelic renaissance, when any company with a press release could raise money on the stock markets. And I was saying, look, there's billions being raised for all these, psychedelic companies. But there's about 4 billion raised by psychedelic companies. But of that, less than 5 million has been spent on harm reduction research or support services. So less than 1% of all that money. There have been hundreds of papers have come out on all different types of psychedelic therapy, 600 papers published on psychedelics in 2022, but about 3 on psychedelic risks, harms, and harm reduction. So I just said, look, we need to start talking about the harms and the risks. That's not to do down these substances or to dismiss their therapeutic and spiritual potential. But no drug that powerful is going to be entirely risk-free or have no side effects. So let's learn about them, and let's learn what helps people who get into difficulties and risks. So that's what we've been doing the last year.
Your website's beautiful, and you have a deck on there as well that shares some of these numbers. Talk to us about that, and what are the harms? What are the risks? To your point, people don't talk about it so much, so sometimes it's in the dark of like what that even means. So just share a little bit more there.
So I'll tell you a bit about what some other papers have found in the last couple of years, and then I can tell you about the kind of main study that we published just like a month ago.
Great.
So we didn't look at prevalence. we didn't look at how often people have bad trips or difficulties after bad trips. What we looked at is what kind of difficulties people get into and what they say is helpful in dealing with those difficulties. But in terms of prevalence, some papers have begun to emerge. So there was a paper this year that found that 9% of people who tried psychedelics reported they had bad trips, which led to functional impairment lasting longer than a day. 6% said they felt at danger of harming themselves or others in the same study. There was something called the Global Ayahuasca Survey. 12,000 people filled in this survey, and 12% of them said they had such difficult experiences that they sought out psychological assistance afterwards, like therapy and so on. These kinds of difficulties also arise in clinical trials. In the MAPS trial of MDMA for PTSD, 7% reported increased feelings of suicidality. In the COMPASS trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, 7% again said it made them feel worse. It led to serious adverse experiences. A lot of people are self-medicating with psychedelics as well, because there aren't many safe clinical places to go, so people are trying it themselves. And in a study this year, 25% of people who self-medicate with mushrooms or LSD report negative effects. And then there's a study about to be published by Johns Hopkins, which found that 7% of people who take psilocybin still report negative effects 2 to 3 months later. There may be positive effects as well, but there's just, it's not all positive. And then there are specifics like hallucination persistent perception disorder. This is like a lot of people after taking psychedelics report visual abnormalities afterwards. Most people aren't disturbed by that. It's like the occasional trail and you go, oh, well, that's a bit trippy. But there is a minority of people who are disturbed, sometimes very disturbed by, things like visual snow syndrome, like, walls moving and so on. And so in one study, 3 to 4% of people who take psychedelics report this disorder where it's actually disturbing to them. And that can last for years. So that gives you some kind of, you're talking about maybe 5 to 10% of people who have difficulties, and those difficulties may last weeks, months, years, or decades. So, what are those experiences like and what helps them? At the moment, we don't know. There's no research on it. What's the evidence-based methods to integrate good or bad trips? We don't know. There's no research on it. Who has the worst case scenario of psychotic episodes or continued psychosis after trips? We don't know. There's no research on it. So it's amazing. 20 years, all that hype, all that positive news put out into the public conversation, which has encouraged people to try psychedelics. The number of people who say they try mushrooms has doubled in the last 3 years. But we don't really know how they go wrong and what to do when it goes wrong. The conversation is beginning to change. Maybe some of your audience went to this enormous conference last month called Psychedelic Science. It was the biggest ever psychedelic conference in Denver. 12,000 people went. It was huge. And I noticed that leaders in the psychedelic field, the mood music had changed a bit. So, I heard Roland Griffiths, who's probably the most famous psychedelic researcher, and he said, some people talk as if psychedelics are completely benign and there are no risks. And he said, no, there are risks. The risk can be catastrophic. Michael Pollan was there. He also said, it's time to talk more about the risks of psychedelics. But mood music is one thing. Actual research is another. Actual data is another. And let me just give you, before we can go on to the research we've done, 2 examples of why this is important. 2 people that I met. So at that conference, where, by the way, there wasn't a panel on harms. It was huge. I mean, it was in this aircraft hangar, basically. It's so many panels and presentations, and there was no panel on harms. But I met someone there who kind of sent me a message on Twitter, and I met up with him. He was an entrepreneur from Argentina called Matthias, and he'd smoked DMT 4 years ago. It was the first time he tried it, and he'd had a bad experience and just kind of shut down from it. Thought, well, that was that, just a bad experience. But problems continued afterwards. He started to get like moments of derealization, weird altered states, and they lasted for years, for 4 years. And he couldn't find any information about this, any research. And he actually came to Denver. He flew from Argentina for this conference just to try and learn, what do I do about this? And I said to him, well, okay, we're still learning. I mean, we've just begun to learn. So he'd really had to figure it out for himself. And the second person, the story that comes to mind is a guy called John, who is a friend of another entrepreneur friend of mine. This entrepreneur friend of mine actually works in the psychedelic space, and they've been so enthusiastic about psychedelics that their friend John said, I need to try this. So John did his research, and he tried mushrooms, and he had a really bad trip, and it led to difficulties that lasted, intense difficulties that lasted for months. And he said to our mutual friend, I researched this. I read the first 10 pages on Google about psychedelics. It didn't tell me anything about this. And, I'm sorry to say, he ended up taking his own life, and he had all the support you can imagine. I mean, our mutual friend works in the industry. So at the very least, he felt there should have been more information about this to give him the ability to make an informed decision.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's why we started the project. The aim is to improve education and reduce suffering, to learn about some of these difficulties, and to learn what helps with these difficulties to reduce the suffering that people feel.
Jules, thanks for sharing those stories. I'm so sorry to hear about John. It's terrible. Structurally, I'm curious, like, is it just that, 2021 was a weird time to raise money, right? Like you said, it was easier than it's been in a long time. But is it just structurally that the upside feels greater, and therefore the possibility to make money is greater? And like, nobody wants to invest in like maintenance, right? Like when people give money to something, it's like, oh, I don't want to pay to maintain something. I want to build the water cellar or whatever it is. Like,
Right.
What are the structural reasons why kind of the harm side of things isn't as developed as sort of like the positive aspects of this?
Right. I think you're right. One of the reasons is people see a lot more profit in investing in the miracle cure.
Yeah.
As you know, VC money has got really excited about mental health as this new frontier, and psychedelics show great promise in that. So that's one reason. Another reason is, so far, most of the research on psychedelics in the last 20 years has been funded by private philanthropists, a small group of them who have given lots of money to this research. And they tend to be true believers in psychedelics' ability to transform humanity. And they're very bought in. They're both very emotionally invested. They're not really necessarily investing in this for profit. They're investing in it because they love psychedelics themselves, and they really believe that it can, it's the thing that will save humanity. And when you're that emotionally invested in something, you don't really want to hear that this could harm people. Yeah. That again is beginning to change. I'm beginning to see some of these big investors, looking at, harm reduction more seriously. So those are, two reasons. I think there's just a kind of, there's also like been a, there were decades of propaganda against psychedelics, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And there's a feeling like, let's just get over the line. Let's get to legalization. Let's get to decriminalization. And then we can, confront some of the issues in our community, like abuse, like adverse experiences, and so on. So there's a fear that if you talk too much about things like adverse experiences, it will give the prohibitionists ammunition and then there might be a backlash, and everyone is kind of traumatized by what happened in the 70s when there'd been like 20 years of research and it got completely shut down. And so people are worried about talking about it. But again, I think that's changed. I think people now feel the momentum is so much with the industry, with these decriminalization proposals, these legalization proposals. In the US, so many cities and states have now passed legislation. Even Kentucky just earmarked 40 million for psychedelic research, state money. Australia has just legalized psychedelic therapy. So I think we're now at a point where that war has somewhat been won. And really, if you're a believer in psychedelics and you want to secure its kind of long-term viability, now is the time to learn more about these risks and not be so afraid of talking about it. Like it's very normal that treatments have side effects. That was the same for antidepressants. It's the same for talking therapy. Yeah. So let's learn about it and try to help people in those difficulties.
I appreciate the context, Jules. So let's dive in. You've produced 2 papers. You have 2 more coming up. Give us kind of an overview of the 2 you've done. You've mentioned one of them already briefly, and then what are the 2 upcoming? Right.
So we launched in September of last year, and we came out with our first paper in January. This was a researcher at the University of Sydney who wanted to collaborate with us. She did her PhD on people, interviewing people who'd gone to mushroom retreats in Holland. And what she found was 30% of her interviewees volunteered information about integration challenges after the retreat. So 1 in 3 people who are going to these retreats have like integration challenges afterwards. And we did a paper on some of those challenges. It was things like you go back home and you feel disconnected from your home situation, or you just feel quite emotionally sensitive and volatile for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. One person felt incredibly spiritual and thought about leaving their job and moving to Bali in the kind of weeks afterwards. Yeah. Some didn't feel supported by the retreat center. So that was just important for some of these kind of clinics and retreat centers to be aware. People are going to be a little bit fragile for kind of 2 to 3 weeks afterwards, like 1 in 3. Then we really wanted to look at extended difficulties after trips. There's a bit of research on what bad or challenging trips are like, but there's very little on difficulties after the trips. So what we did was a kind of mixed method study. We sent out a survey and we asked people, have you ever had difficulties after a trip lasting longer than a day? Tell us a bit about that. Describe the difficulties in your own words, and then tell us what helped with those difficulties. What helped to get back to normal functioning? So we got 608 responses. And to give you a little snapshot, a third of the respondents said their difficulties lasted longer than a year. And a sixth of respondents said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years. So for some people, it was decades. So sometimes these difficulties can last a long time. We looked a bit at what context people took the original trip in that led to the difficulties. Mainly it was recreational. Mainly it was people tripping alone. It's difficult, you shouldn't be too quick to infer that means that context leads to difficulties, because it's just also the popular method to trip at the moment. Yeah. But 8% of our respondents had taken psychedelics in clinical trials or therapeutic settings. So even in these very safe settings, some of these extended difficulties can happen. 40% said they had a childhood trauma that they thought may have led to these or contributed to their bad trip and extended difficulties. So looking forward, we need to think about trauma-informed psychedelic therapy and psychedelic retreats, because it seems like people with trauma are more likely to have not just difficult trips, but difficulties beyond the trip. That makes sense.
And it's even with meditation and stuff, right? It's like you can go into those 10-day silent retreats, and if you have some depressive or manic kind of situations, that has no, you can end up in difficult spots even with that, right?
That's right. And we were quite inspired by some of the research on adverse experiences in meditation,
Yeah.
which came out about a decade ago, people like
Yeah.
Willoughby Britton and so on. And that research has led to what they call like trauma-informed meditation retreats.
Yeah.
And so something similar needs to arise in the psychedelic space.
Yeah. And Jules, I'm curious, like, how is this, at the risk of asking a stupid question, like, is it possible that you have a good trip in the moment, but after reflecting on it, it scares you, or you have some of these adverse effects later? Or is it purely like you have a bad trip and then, these negative consequences happen? Just talk to us a little bit about that.
It can, yeah. I mean, we asked people to describe the difficulties. We've got, can you imagine, kind of over 600 responses of people writing, some people paragraphs, some people, just few words. So this incredible data set of people describing, just snapshots of their lives. And some people had incredibly powerful mystical experiences, but then came back to their life context and didn't feel the people around them understood it. They didn't feel they had anyone to talk to about it. So one of the most common difficulties people reported was social disconnection. Where are my people? Where's my tribe? Who do I talk to about this? You go to a retreat, you feel deeply connected with a group of strangers in the Amazon, and then you go back to Milwaukee or Yorkshire or whatever, and you're with people who don't have that kind of incredibly powerful mystical experience. And they can also just be bewildering as well. So we read a lot and we hear a lot about how psychedelics can give people this sense of cosmic meaning. And that's true, but it can also lead to cosmic confusion. Another of the most common difficulties was existential struggle. People are like, what do I do with that? I mean, it was extraordinary, but how do I make sense of it? How do I fit it into my belief system, into the narrative of myself? And these are just, and don't forget as well, Blas, that these are, we ask people, tell us about the difficulties you experience, but there may also be difficulties that people don't even recognize as difficulties. People might get super high, super spiritual, and not actually in a particularly long-term functional way. People might go down rabbit holes of conspiracy thinking. So we didn't even look at that, the kind of adverse experiences which aren't recognized as such at the time.
The disconnected piece almost makes me think of like veterans coming back from war, right? Like that PTSD type thing of like, I was so connected with my tribe, with my troop. I was fighting for something bigger than myself, and now I'm just back home and I feel empty. And obviously different experiences, but that disconnection piece, it resonates a lot.
I mean, you people going on retreats, they're getting a kind of bungee jump into tribal animist culture. And that intense feeling of togetherness with strangers, and then they're bouncing out back into Western atomized society. And that's a shock.
It makes me think also of the very powerful, to me, Jungian line of like, beware wisdom you didn't earn. And like, you can bungee jump into it, but it's a very different, that shotgun approach can obviously have these negative considerations we're talking about.
You're absolutely right. And we have, discovered an express route to incredibly powerful mystical experiences, but without necessarily having the maps, the guides, the general cultural, like what I call ecstatic literacy, to make sense of these experiences. In the Middle Ages, there were all these monasteries, all these literally guides to altered states of consciousness. And we don't really have that now. So, it's not just individuals struggling to integrate these experiences, it's cultures as a whole trying to make sense of them.
Sorry, I derailed you from the papers, but that was really helpful.
Fine.
So
and feel free, and anyone else, just as well, feel free to kind of put your hand up or whatever. So we had all these difficult, over 600 descriptions of people's difficulties. We did a thematic analysis of them to make a kind of taxonomy of what kind of difficulties people experience, the weird rooms that people can end up in the mansion of the mind. And people ended up in quite similar rooms quite often. So, people would say, I thought I was dead, or I thought, everything was unreal, and they won't be alone in that. So the most common kinds of difficulties were, well, the most common was responses that talked about anxiety and fear. A quarter of responses talked about feeling often really bad anxiety. Let me see if I've got some quotes if you want, I can read out. So,
Yeah.
So here's one response, for example. For about 18 months, I awoke with the sun every morning, full of a feeling of absolute terror. Sometimes my anxiety would be so high in the morning that I would physically shake from the energy. And there were many different kind of subtypes of anxiety and fear. There was the fear of going mad, the fear of dying. Sometimes that increased after really bad trips. The fear of going back to that place that you felt kind of stuck in. And people sometimes said also they felt traumatized, kind of post-psychedelic trauma, or earlier trauma was released by the trip and they felt kind of overwhelmed by it. So a lot of responses relating to anxiety and fear, and that tallies with some of the other research that's beginning to come out. 17% of people talked about existential struggle and confusion. Here's another quote. I entered the experience believing that my experience is the literal, real, external world. The experience contained experiences that were so bizarre and dreamlike, I could not make sense of them. And it left a legacy of confusion about what deeper model of reality to use, and repeated experiences of flipping between different models. 16% of our respondents reported experiences that we themed as like derealization and depersonalization. Sometimes people use those terms. Derealization is when you suddenly feel like external reality is unreal, that you're in like a video game or a dream, or possibly in the afterlife of some sort. And depersonalization is similar. It's this feeling of a kind of fragmented or shattered self. So here's one quote. I felt like my mind had been shattered into a million pieces, like it was no longer connected to my body. I'm still not 100% right. And then the last two main themes were social disconnection, which I've mentioned. Here's one quote. I felt very disconnected from everything and everyone around me. The trip was the most powerful experience of my life. And I felt destroyed and terrified for weeks after, with no one around me that I could relate to about it at all. And then 12% reported visual distortions, this kind of HPPD type or visual snow type experience.
What's HPPD?
Hallucination persistent perception disorder. That's these kind of, visual distortions. And for a lot of these people, they didn't have the terms for it. Yeah. So there's this feeling, am I going psychotic? Am I going schizophrenic? What do I do? And that just, the kind of lack of information and the lack of other people having similar stories massively amplifies the fear of all these kinds of experiences.
Well, in your paper too, I think you mentioned one of the goals is to create this literacy, this language to help people navigate it, right? Because like you said, that otherwise you just jump to conclusions that could be far scarier than they might otherwise be.
Exactly right. We think this is really important because people feel really alone and frightened and bewildered. And just get information and data out there. You're not alone. Other people have been through similar experiences. People told us that they often felt, when they had this experience, they couldn't find any information on it. And then they find like one mention in a book or one thing in a documentary. And even that is helpful to them. And then maybe eventually they find their way to a Stan Grof book or something. So it's sharing similar stories. It's helping people to come to terms with their experience. It's helping therapists and clinicians also be more familiar with the kind of landscape. And then, asking people what helped them with these difficulties as well.
Yeah. And Jules, so the need for this in the world is obvious, right? Like every, there's a shadow side to every positive. But why is it your mission? I'm curious, like what the connection is for you. Like, you're obviously so invested in this and, building your life around it. Like what's your personal tie to all of it?
I've always been drawn to spirituality, altered states since I was a teenager. Like, I suppose Aldous Huxley was my prophet when I was at school.
Mm,
And my friends and I were very into psychedelics. A lot of people in the psychedelic space now, kind of people setting up companies, even their first experience was like 4 years ago,
yeah.
and they've only had good experiences. And they're like, this is incredible. This is going to save the world. Like, and then they were the kind of grizzled veterans who kind of were doing it in their teens, and they often have different perspectives. So,
Yeah.
I saw, my best friend had a psychotic episode on LSD when he was 16, and he still has psychosis. May have happened anyway. We don't know because there's no research. And I had a bad trip or a challenging trip when I was 18. Just led to kind of intense paranoia. And I thought, I didn't talk to anyone about it in kind of typical English way, not my friends or family. And I thought that, brushed it off. But then when I went to university, I started to get panic attacks, nightmares, dissociation, derealization, none of which I had the terms for. So I was like, what the hell is going on? Was after university, I was diagnosed with PTSD and social anxiety.
Mm,
And I had to figure out for myself what would happen to me and what would help me get better. That's what led me to kind of Stoic philosophy, cognitive
mm,
therapy, and so on. So that really started me on my journey, my interest in philosophy and in mental health. And I still, it didn't turn me off altered states. So I still wrote a book of, The Art of Losing Control, about how these ecstatic experiences can sometimes be helpful and healing and harmful. But it gave me the sense that, like, our culture is like ecstatically naive. We need to learn more about, how to integrate these experiences, how to think maturely about them. And I guess, why I'm passionate about this project is I remember what it was like being 18 and thinking, what's happening? Have I permanently damaged my brain? Have I ruined my life?
yeah,
Feeling like you've become a different person and you don't know what to do about it.
yeah,
And I feel like that was unnecessarily, I grew from the suffering. I became different, maybe in some ways a better person. But did I have to suffer for so many years? I
yeah,
think that could have been condensed, the learning from that experience.
yeah.
So yeah, so when people reach out to me, I naturally feel a kind of, empathy for them, because I recognize the younger me in that. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
this is look, there are so many problems in the world, but this is a problem where I can put my effort and make it a little bit better by just encouraging research, encouraging evidence-based support, and also trying to shift the public conversation, so it's not just focused on the positives, which are definitely real and true, but there's also some talk about the risks and the harms, so that people don't feel, oh, I had a bad experience, and feel ashamed of it, and like, oh, there's everyone else is having these super incredible mystical experiences, and it was just me that had a bad experience. And actually that is not the case. When you know people in the field, everyone either directly or indirectly knows about these harder experiences.
mm,
And I think we've done that in our first year. Like, we've produced this first paper on the types of extended difficulties people are having. We're finishing this month a kind of sister paper about what people said helped them with these difficulties. That is, believe it or not, the first empirical paper on integration of psychedelic
mm,
experiences and on integration of difficult experiences.
mm,
Also, just in this first year budget, we're diving deeper into this difficulty of existential confusion. and what helps people with it. So we're doing interviews with like 30 people who responded to our survey to dive a bit deeper into that. And I think we've had a lot of media coverage, like Daily Mail, Politico, Vice, Wired, Rebel Wisdom, the Evening Standard, so we're making it, I feel like, more okay to talk about the harms and risks, but in a sensible way, not in a prohibitionist way, not in a demonizing way, always talking about the benefits as well. So just a more balanced conversation. And I feel like our project has encouraged other researchers to kind of talk more about harms and harm reduction. So I feel we've made a difference already in our first year. And I also have a sense of just like, what needs to be done? What are the priorities? What are the burning research questions that need to be answered? And what are the bits of infrastructure that need to be in place for the culture?
Jules, thanks for sharing and opening up. And it's moving and beautiful. So thank you for that. It's going to be an awkward pivot after something like that, but talk to us about.
This was a long time ago, so I don't. I'm fine with awkward pivots.
Yeah, beautiful. But it ties together, both kind of like the two papers coming up, but also that one thing that I wish existed in the world is like the big audacious questions in every field. Like, what are they and who's working on them? So if we kind of made that for you, like, what are those in your mind, like those biggest outstanding questions? I'm guessing some of your upcoming papers deal with some of that, but if they don't, why not? Just give us a little bit of an overview there.
Yeah, there's some that we are trying to answer, and there's some that we can't at the moment. So I've thought about this a lot, and I'd love, I think the most, and I've tried to think about it not in terms of how do we get money, but like, what are the questions that need answering?
Yeah.
And I feel like what the questions that need answering are, why do some people have bad trips and it leads to difficulties that last for a few days? And for some people, it leads to difficulties that last years.
Yeah.
How can we reduce the incidence, the intensity, and the duration of these difficulties? What kind of framings help people? What helps people with specific difficulties? Our paper, we talk generally about what helps people with difficulties.
Yeah. We
want to do another paper really narrowing down, okay, in this particular difficulty, are there particular kinds of coping mechanisms that help people? So we also like, what do the guides and the therapists and the shamans say? They have expertise as well. So interviewing psychedelic therapists, integration therapists, but also people from, psychiatrists, but also shamans. What is their theory of adverse experiences? What do they see people presenting to them? Are there some things that they see, people coming to them for help a lot? And what do they find helpful? It might be different to what people say themselves. So I've just begun to kind of interview some psychedelic, some post-psychedelic therapists. And, they tell me interesting things about the kinds of difficulties they're seeing, people coming to them for help for. And then can we begin to get an idea of the predictive factors that make some people more likely to have bad trips, challenging trips, and more likely to have extended difficulties? There are some papers beginning to appear, but that research needs to be drawn together. For example, if you're younger when you take psychedelics or older, does that make you more likely to have difficulties? Gender, economic situation, your social support network. If you have a weaker social support network, does that make it more like So, it's always still going to be a little bit of a roll of the dice, but maybe you can kind of begin to see, okay, like with all these factors, you might be more likely to have a difficult experience. So think more about the support that's in place afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. And even like you said, just almost mnemonics where it's like, it's like setting, dosage, guide, whatever, but there's also these other variables or vectors to consider, right? Of like, yeah. And to your point, it's not, to be careful of like cause and effect, but don't do it just recreationally when you're in a bad spot or whatever it might be. And yeah,
sure. I mean, that's right. Another of the variables is intention. Like there was a survey that came out of Canada of psychedelic use, and one of the predictors they suggested that seems to be correlated with difficult trips was intention. Like if you're just bored, that's not a great intention. And that was one of the most common intentions that people, I was just bored. So yeah, and then of course there might be genetic factors as well. Part of psychedelic law is if you ever read about psychedelic risks or harms, or you hear about it like on the Andrew Huberman show or the Joe Rogan show, what you'll hear is don't do psychedelics if you have a family history of psychosis. But actually there's no evidence for that. I mean, it's probably a good idea, but it's never been studied. It's just law, I mean, not law, LORE. It's just so there's beginning to be studies of genetic risk factors for psychosis with relationship to cannabis. So that's not something because it's expensive. It's not something we have on our agenda for next year, but I think it's really important to do. Because the worst case scenario is people having kind of psychotic breaks, or then developing, long-term psychosis. That's and people dying in kind of fatal accidents or taking their own lives. So I think that no one's talking about doing those kind of genetic tests, but I think it's worthwhile to do that eventually. And then the big kind of questions are, how do we improve the ecstatic literacy of Western culture? What are the best different sorts of cultural containers for ecstatic and psychedelic experiences? What are the best kind of ethical safeguards for them, whether you're talking about a psychedelic church or a psychedelic clinic or just people tripping at a festival? And that's like a multi-year kind of project. And it's not just about psychedelics either. It's about how we relate to unusual states of mind. So that's the big fish.
That's fascinating. And the two papers that are coming up, which questions do they specifically try to answer?
So the two papers that are still part of this year and this year's budget, one is like what helps people who have, but in general, with difficult experiences. So it's from this survey we did. It's data from that survey. So we just asked people, what did you find helpful? Yeah. And it's things like reaching out for support from friends and family, talking therapy. Some people talked a bit about what kinds of therapy, and then certain self-care methods like meditation, like exercise, like yoga. So, but we also, a team in Israel at the University of Haifa, with their own budget, have kind of collaborated with us. So they're doing 3 papers as well. One interviewing people who said they were helped by therapy to try to find out what kind of therapy, this kind of thing. Another paper on people who said they were helped by meditation, interviewing like 30 people for that. And then a third paper looking at childhood trauma as a predictor of difficulties. So that's great for us because we didn't have to fund that. They raised their own money, but so we're trying to support other teams of researchers to use our data to collaborate us where we can. We're trying to kind of multiply. Effect.
Open source it in a way, right?
Yeah. And people have approached us with can we do machine learning analysis? But the kind of stuff for next year that I really like to look at is why do some people's difficulties last so much longer than others? So interviewing people who said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years, this sixth of our respondents, what kind of difficulties last so long? Like we just asked, how long did your difficulties last? Maybe there's specific kinds of difficulties which really lead to these kinds of chronic problems. So I think that's important to ask. then we also like this thing where we're going to interview like therapists, psychiatrists, and shamans for like their perspective, their experience about what kinds of difficulties people present with and what they find helpful. And then the risk factors as well. Basically doing a meta study, trying to gather together some of the findings about predictive factors for difficult trips and extended difficulties. The last initiative as well is we're just beginning to start something called the Psychedelic Harm Research Alliance, which is basically like trying to connect some of the researchers who are beginning to look at difficulties so that we're not replicating each other's efforts, so that we're sharing data, talking to each other, what are the research gaps that need to be filled, and also talking about, what needs to be in place that's not here already. There are some, if you're lucky and you have a bad trip at a festival, there might be something like Zendo Project or PsyCare. If you're lucky during a bad trip, you might have the wherewithal to phone the Fireside Project. But what other bits of the kind of landscape need to be in place to support people?
Beautiful. Thank you. Akeem, I know you raise your hand. What do you have for Jules here?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jules. This is really helpful. I have myself no experience with psychedelics yet. And so I experience it from that angle, right? That I see this renaissance and I really want to engage. And I'm also in a society where if I talk with people about it, they, are extremely worried. And it's good to have this balanced approach, right? Because I can also attest that I only hear from the community, let's say, from people that bring that forward, only the good things, that there are hardly any side effects, right? And now I'm very interested in, like, when you talk about difficulties and extended difficulties, it's such a fascinating subject because we are talking, you mentioned it, about the psyche, right? And also about experience that are in our own head, right? So if we have, I don't know, I broke my arm, somebody is fixing it, like people can relate to it easily, right? They see what happens.
Yes,
they have
it's an objective thing.
Yes. And so, of course, I experienced something. For example, I've heard that some people say, like, if you have a bad trip, it's not, well, it's bad, but maybe it's the trip you needed, or maybe it's just this experience, which is unpleasant, but it's still part of the good side, let's say, of psychedelics. Now, obviously, if I then wake up and basically have to deal with this, right, then a lot of things can happen. A lot of things I might attribute it now. I have experienced something, so I anchor it in that experience, and it has an effect. Like, my question is, like, do you have a taxonomy for like what is an extended difficulties? What types of extended difficulties can be there, and how to distinguish them from things like, I broke my arm, it gets fixed, and then, I don't know, I get into a fight or I do something physical, and then it's like, oh, because my arm is fixed, that was the reason that I got into the fight. But that's not really cause and effect, right? It's just the extended life that happens after having a change.
I mean, this is a really good question, and it's part of the challenge of talking about and studying adverse experiences. In clinical trials, for example, clinical trials have to report adverse events, but it's actually the scientists doing the trial who decide if an adverse event is connected to the drug and treatment or not. And often because they want to get positive results, they'll say that's just random events, that's not connected to the treatment. So you can ask people, do you think this was connected to the psychedelics? But they might be wrong. But at least I think it's worth still listening to them. And sometimes these, but 40% of people had mental health diagnoses before they answered our survey, but they felt that the psychedelics didn't make it easier. It didn't give them the healing they were hoping for, or not entirely, because it's also the case that often these experiences are ambivalent. People would say it did improve some aspects of, the depression got less, but my anxiety got worse. And so I think at the moment, the medical conversation, the public conversation about psychedelics can be quite simplistic and say, you know, and somewhat religious. Like, okay, before you're lost, then you have this mystical experience, and now you're kind of saved and you're better. People often have more an ambivalent attitude. They feel that maybe in some ways, even though it was a very difficult experience, there were some positives to it, and there were also some negatives to it. We asked people, do you still believe in the healing potential of psychedelics in a proper kind of context? Over 80% of people still agreed with that. But then we had a box afterwards, is there anything you'd like to add? And I just actually published an article just with some of those responses, because they're so interesting. There are people saying like, was it worth it? I don't know. I mean, in some ways it made me who I am, but it was years of suffering. Would I recommend it to someone else? So it's hard to say. And that's even true of, you know, if people get cancer, they might say, well, it kind of made me who I am, you know, or if, so, you know, we didn't ask, do you regret taking psychedelics? Because I didn't want to ask people, you know, do you feel you messed up your life, you know, but I mean, speaking for myself, my psychedelic experiences made my life harder. I feel like it made my life harder, but it didn't necessarily make me a worse person. You know what I mean? It kind of made me who I am, so I don't entirely regret it. These are all some of the challenges of researching and writing about adverse experiences. I should also say that it's true that many of the respondents to our survey did feel that all the difficulties they experienced were part of a healing process. Some didn't. Some feel, I regret it, that just made my life harder. But many felt that actually it was ultimately beneficial for them. So that is the case, you know, that some people will go through years of suffering, but still feel that somehow they grew from it. I should also say, for people who haven't tried psychedelics, like, we are talking about, you know, 5 to 10% of cases, and, you know, usually it leads to kind of, you know, some weeks or months, rather than, you know, the kind of years. It's rare, but that doesn't mean we should just abandon people in that situation to their fate, because it is still a bit rolling the dice. It's going to happen to people with years of experience. The more we know about those minority of cases, the more people can go into trips with confidence, and not thinking, if this random, you know, occurrence happens, there's no research about it and there's no support for it.
Thanks, Hakeem. And Jules, in terms of the different types of psychedelics, is there one that seems to be, you know, higher chances of having a challenging trip versus others, or has that research been done, or what can you tell us about that?
There's a lot of research that needs to be done on that. We did a statistical analysis of what substances seem to lead to longer difficulties. That we got that far, and it was LSD, ayahuasca, and DMT seem to lead to longer difficulties, whilst MDMA and psilocybin seem to lead to shorter difficulties. Why might that be? Possible reasons: LSD lasts for 12 hours. So if you're having a bad time, that's a long bad time. And then DMT and ayahuasca can take you into very different kind of worlds. They can lead to like what some people call like ontological shock. And so that might lead to kinds of, you know, trauma or confusion. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this, the research is still to be done.
Yeah,
like,
thanks for sharing that.
Do some types of substances lead to specific types of difficulties? Is derealization more common with DMT and ayahuasca, for example? So that's all to be studied, really. Interesting.
A lot of knowledge gaps here that will be exciting to uncover. Jules, I want to make sure we're mindful of your time. I'd love to end with just like, how can we support you, right? We mentioned kind of the upcoming research, your fundraising a little bit. How do we help get the word out? What types of people are you looking for? What else is top of mind? But yeah, how can we help?
Right. Well, I mean, so the first year of this, we raised like just $100,000 from two private philanthropists, one of whom I teach philosophy to and has no connection to psychedelics, but they just thought this sounded like a good project and supported us. The other one has a bit more kind of connection to that world. And just that money enabled us to produce like 4 papers this year, and the presentations, and all the media work we've done. So we're looking for $200,000 next year. We've already raised 50,000 of that, and kind of each bit of that will support a different type of activity. So like for the paper on looking at long-term difficulties, that will be like $30,000. The paper interviewing therapists, psychiatrists, and shamans, that will be another $30,000. Building a network of this psychedelic harm research alliance is another. In doing a seminar and in kind of gathering people together is another. So that's what I say to kind of philanthropists, is that they can fund specific bits if they're interested. And in fact, the first philanthropist who's kind of pledged support for us next year, they're particularly interested in our public communication, in the kind of public education bit of our work.
Yeah.
So and then if you want to take part in it as well, like, I mean, we also have a newsletter that you might be interested in, Ecstatic Integration. How we speak about psychedelics as well, like in terms of the public conversation about it, like communicating that sometimes there are these kinds of harms as well, not always, but sometimes. So it's about having a more mature, nuanced conversation about it. If you think there are collaborators that you'd like to connect us to, that would be awesome too.
And to make that concrete, Jules, collaborators in what sense? Just to, so it's clear in our minds.
Well, for example, machine learning analysis, that could be very useful. If there are people who are really good at content creation, and particularly like short videos for part of our public education strategy, like getting it out to younger people, on things like TikTok, that's an important part of our work. So yeah, I mean, I think we've been helped by people like, for example, another entrepreneur philanthropist has been really helpful to us on strategy and vision, and is working to help us put together this Psychedelic Harm Research Alliance, and basically, helping academics think in terms of, long-term vision, that kind of thing. So if people are kind of into the mission, like bringing your skills as well, entrepreneurial skills, those kinds of things, that can be very helpful too. And we also have a kind of advisory board, and we are also figuring this out as we go. So, advice on messaging, or if you think there are particular kind of research gaps as well, we're trying to learn as we go as well. And particularly nuancing the message, so that we're, finding that right balance between there are these harms and risks, but these can also be incredibly healing. So yeah, we're if people work on kind of campaigns, we're always interested in advice. Just like, have a conversation with us.
Yeah, Jules, this has been fascinating, man. I on the ML AI side, that's kind of my world. Happy to chat offline and sort of figure out what's helpful there. And yeah, I think so much of this is just a communication piece, right? Of course, there's research to be done to know kind of like what to communicate, but you mentioned this already, so it's preaching to the choir, but just making it part of the conversation and knowing just awareness, right? Like that simple piece of it is so much of this. And
I'm a journalist, but my experience is not in video, for example. And things like so that kind of thing, I think we're very open to advice and
amazing. And Jules, if I can ask, we have the PDF you sent. I've taken notes and we'll kind of gather notes to share with the rest of the community. But are you comfortable with me sharing your email and that with like within this group and kind of putting these
100%.
asks? Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
So we'll kind of throw that together. But this has been fascinating. Thank you again for joining us, for the work that you're doing. It's incredibly important.
Thank you so much for taking an hour of your time to listen to me natter on, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for putting this together, Blas. Thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. We'll be in touch, Jules. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for
Thank
joining.
you.
See you.